Dim the lights, my friend. Let the world shrink to the small glow of your screen and the steady rhythm of your breath. Set the phone beside your pillow or rest it softly in your palms. Either way, let this moment become a cocoon around you. The day is done. Nothing urgent is knocking. The only thing asked of you now is to be still, to listen, and to drift. Wrap yourself in your blanket like it's a medieval cloak, worn soft by time. Feel its weight, not too heavy, just enough to remind you that you are here, grounded, safe. Maybe there's the faint tick of a clock somewhere, or the hush of wind brushing the window pane. Maybe it's just silence. That's good. That's perfect. Because tonight we will step into the past together. Not in the way of textbooks or loud documentaries, but gently, like following a narrow path into the woods that leads to something ancient, something real. This is not the history of kings or warriors. Not tonight. Tonight we walk beside the unnoticed, those whose names rarely reached parchment. We will speak of the women of the medieval world, the washer and the cook, the midwife and the mother. The girl with ink-stained sleeves and the healer with lavender tucked into her hair. Their lives, though dim in the historical spotlight, shimmer quietly beneath the surface of time, waiting for someone like you, to pause and hear them. Close your eyes if you wish. Let your imagination take the reins. Breathe in, slowly, and exhale even slower. Now let's begin. It is a grey morning in the year 1273, in a village tucked between damp forests and fields still heavy with dew. Smoke curls upward from rough chimneys, drawing crooked lines into a pale sky. The thatched roofs of the homes are speckled with moss, their wooden beams darkened with age and seasons. The village is small, perhaps a few dozen families, but bustling in its quiet way. A woman, not much older than 30, is already at the stream. Her hands raw and red from the icy water as she scrubs linen against a smooth stone. Her name is no longer known, but her life was real. You can see her there if you try. Her long dress damp at the hem, her fingers moving rhythmically, her breath forming little clouds in the cold morning air. She is not alone. Another woman kneels beside her, and another. They murmur to one another in soft voices. A joke about someone's runaway goat, a worry about a child's cough. These small conversations are the threads of community, woven over water and work, over blisters and laughter. History may not have recorded them, but they were the heartbeat of medieval life. For many women, the day began long before the sun stirred. The hearth fire had to be coaxed back to life from its embers. Bread dough prepared the night before needed to be baked. Children were nudged awake, fed, and, if they were old enough, sent to their own small chores, gathering wood, feeding chickens, carrying water in sloshing buckets almost as heavy as themselves. In this world, a woman's life was not measured in years, so much as in seasons and burdens. She was a girl, then a wife, then a mother, if she survived. Each phase blurred into the next with little ceremony, marked only by the sudden weight of new expectations. At 13 or 14, a girl might be married, arranged by her parents, of course, with no room for protest. Sometimes the man was twice her age, already with grey in his beard. She would move to his home, carry his name, and begin bearing his children before her body was truly grown. The idea of consent, of personal choice, was foreign. It was not cruelty in the eyes of the time. It was the way things were. But within this rigid framework, women found ways to carve out small freedoms. They gathered in the fields and spoke in whispers. They passed recipes and herbs and quiet rebellions from one generation to the next. A midwife might learn secrets from her grandmother, how to ease a birth, how to brew a tea that might delay one. These secrets were not written down, but passed from palm to palm like pressed flowers. There was danger in knowledge, of course. A woman who knew too much might be called a witch. A woman who healed more than she hurt might draw suspicion. But they did it anyway, because life demanded it. In towns and cities, the rhythm changed, but the burdens remained. A woman might be a spinner, twisting wool into thread for long hours by the fire, or a laundress, scrubbing noblemen's linens in great tubs until her hands cracked and bled. Some were servants in the homes of the wealthy, rising before dawn to scrub floors and polish pewter. Others sold fish, bread, or herbs in the market, their voices lost in the din of trade and barter. And then there were the nuns, women who found another path, not always by choice. Some sought the quiet of the cloister. Others were given to it, too young to know whether they wanted such silence. In the convent, they copied manuscripts, grew gardens, tended the sick. Their lives were strict, but sometimes safer. But even behind monastery walls, life was not simple. Hunger visited all. Disease did not knock, it simply entered. And loneliness was its own shadow, especially for those who longed for lives they could not name. Still, joy existed. In the festivals where women danced with skirts flying, in the baking of sweet breads for saints' days, in the hush of a sleeping baby against a mother's breast, in the laughter shared under starlight while spinning tales by firelight. These joys were fragile, but they were fiercely kept. Let's stay a while with a single village. Not a famous one, just an ordinary place, like hundreds across England or France or the Holy Roman Empire. Its name is long forgotten, but its people once lived with the same intensity as we do now. There's a widow who bakes bread. Her name might have been Agnes. She is 60, which in her time is considered a great age. She lost her husband to fever many years ago. Her son went to war and did not return. But she keeps her oven lit, the scent of warm loaves filling the street each morning. She takes in 2 young girls as helpers, not out of kindness necessarily, but out of necessity. They help knead the dough, sweep the floor, stoke the fire. In exchange, she teaches them how to survive. Across the path, a woman named Isabeau is giving birth. Her screams are muffled by straw-stuffed walls. A midwife kneels at her feet, a girl presses a cool rag to her forehead, and outside her mother grips a rosary with white-knuckled hands. This is her 5th child. She has already buried 2. There is no physician here, no clean water or sterile tools, just skill and prayer and hope. And often that was enough. But not always. Some births ended in joy, some in silence. And the women who bore those losses carried them for life, sometimes buried beneath tight-lipped smiles or quietly tended graves marked with no more than a stone. And what of the seasons? Ah, the seasons were everything. In spring, women planted seeds with fingers still aching from winter's chill. They prayed for soft rains and cursed the late frosts that could kill a sprouting hope in a single night. Children ran barefoot in the thawing mud, and the smell of wet earth was both promise and reminder of labor to come. In summer, the sun scorched shoulders and faces. Women worked side by side in the fields, harvesting wheat, barley, and rye. They sang while they worked, not because life was easy, but because singing helped the hours pass. There were berries to gather, herbs to dry, linens to bleach under the sun. Autumn brought the rush of harvest. Root vegetables were pulled from the soil. Apples and pears were picked, meat smoked or salted. The air turned crisp, and the smell of wood smoke curled through the air like a lullaby. For a moment, there was a sense of plenty. And then came winter. Hard, bitter winter. When the hearth fire was the difference between waking and not. When soup was thinned with water and still it was not enough. When shoes had holes and fingers cracked from cold. When blankets were shared and sometimes it was the only warmth to be had. But even then, women endured. They mended what could be mended. They sang lullabies. They whispered old tales. They buried the dead and greeted the living with quiet strength. This is only the beginning of their story. And we will continue. The snow has settled over the thatched rooftops now. Frost etches itself onto the edges of wooden door frames. The village, tucked somewhere in the bend of a low valley, is still under the dim glow of the afternoon sun, pale and slow in the sky. And the women are still there, moving through their world like ghost lanterns of warmth against the cold. Let's follow one. Her name might be Ellen. She is young, perhaps 20, though time ages differently here. Her hands are chapped. She carries a woven basket of dried herbs, yarrow, sage, thyme, and a bit of mugwort wrapped in cloth. The basket is old, passed down from her mother, and perhaps from her mother before that. Ellen walks through the village like someone who belongs to its soil, who understands its patterns. Her knowledge is quiet but vast. She knows how to treat a fever, how to ease a cough with honey steeped in warm milk, how to calm a child with the scent of lavender wrapped in linen. She knows that too much nightshade is poison and too little is useless. She knows how to pull a baby into the world when all signs say it cannot come. People fear her, just a little. But they need her more than they fear her. She lives alone on the edge of the village in a cottage barely taller than she is. The inside smells of smoke and drying rosemary. There are feathers tucked into corners, a cat that watches from a rafter, and a shelf of tiny glass jars that catch the light when the door creaks open. These are not signs of mystery to her. They are tools. Survival, stacked and labelled. The priest passes her without speaking. The baker's wife nods curtly, but never makes eye contact. But when their children cough or their husbands limp from field work, they come to her door with lowered voices and cupped hands. And Ellen helps them. She always helps. There is a loneliness in being needed but not welcomed. She bears it in silence. And then one day, a woman, heavy with child, arrives in the snow. Her labor has come early, her breath quick and frightened. Ellen doesn't hesitate. The fire is stoked. Cloth is boiled. The child arrives under a full moon, slick with life and screaming. The mother weeps with relief. When the villagers hear, they shake their heads but say nothing. And Ellen, as always, says nothing back. She has done her part, as her mother did, as her daughter may one day. Now travel with me, not far, just beyond the village, to the grounds of a noble estate. The manor looms in wood and stone, surrounded by high walls and guarded gates. Within, life looks different, but it is no less difficult. Meet Beatrix. She is noble-born, yes, but that does not mean free. Her gowns are heavier, her meals richer, but her path was drawn before she ever took her first steps. At 14, she was betrothed to a man 10 years her senior. The match was strategic. Land for title, title for alliance. The wedding was a spectacle. Embroidered veils, silver goblets, an ox roasted whole in the courtyard. And yet, Beatrix felt the cold press of fear beneath every silk ribbon tied around her wrists. Now at 17, she sits in the solar beside a leaded window, embroidering a tapestry she no longer cares to finish. Her husband is often away, hunting, drinking, inspecting lands. When he returns, he demands obedience, not conversation. She is expected to produce an heir. So far, she has not. 2 pregnancies lost to winter fevers, 1 stillborn. The pressure curls around her like a noose. Every missed cycle brings fresh hope, then fresh dread. Her days are filled with tasks that look soft from a distance. Needlework, reading scripture, overseeing the kitchen. But the truth is, she is watched constantly. Her lady's maids report everything. Her steward manages every penny. Her father-in-law questions her fertility in front of servants. Her title is lady, but she has no domain. In the night, she sometimes climbs the narrow stairs to the tower where the old books are kept. She runs her fingers over the parchment, the ink faded but still legible. Medical texts, herbal knowledge, prayers written in Latin. She copies the ones she understands, hides them beneath the lining of a trunk. It is the only rebellion she can afford. One day she may pass these texts to a daughter, or to a maid, or to no one at all. But even then, the knowledge will have lived longer than the chains around her wrists. Let us shift again, this time to the walls of a convent tucked deep in the mountains. Here lives Hildegard. Not the famous one, but a woman nonetheless full of thought and thunder. She took vows at 16, not by calling, but because her dowry was not enough for marriage and her brothers had use for the land. Still, she grew into the life. The silence taught her how to listen, and in listening she heard things others did not. She writes by candlelight. Not poetry, not songs, but dreams, visions that come to her like birds in the night. She does not speak of them to the abbess. Instead, she fills a small ledger bound in rough cloth with sketches and symbols. A wheel of time, a spiral staircase, a woman with stars for eyes. Are they sacred? Are they madness? It does not matter to Hildegard. They are hers. In the convent garden, she tends rosemary and rue. She sings while she works, not loudly, but enough for the bees to recognize her voice. The other sisters think her strange, but when their bellies ache or sleep won't come, they find her with downcast eyes. She gives them tea. She asks no questions. Outside the convent walls, the world shifts. Monarchs rise and fall. Laws are passed, wars declared, cities burned. But within the cloister, time is slower. Like honey, it stretches without breaking. And Hildegard writes through it all. One day, long after her bones have turned to dust, a monk will find her ledger behind a stone in the wall. He will not know what it means, but he will keep it, and so her dreams will survive. Now let's pause, not to stop, but to soften. Take a deep breath. Imagine the hush of snowfall outside a wooden door, Imagine the warmth of a candle flame flickering in the corner of a stone room. Imagine the scent of baking bread, of wool drying by the fire, of lavender tucked in a satchel. These were the comforts women made for themselves, because comfort was not given freely. It was built slowly out of scraps, out of the lullabies sung to restless babies, out of the way women whispered stories to one another while spinning flax, out of the way a hand brushed another hand at the well, not romantic but tender, human. They were not saints, they gossiped, they lied, they grew jealous, they despaired. They were human, completely. But their lives were shaped like clay against a relentless wheel. And still they made something of it. They made homes out of ruin. They made warmth out of ash. They made meaning out of silence. And tonight, we remember them. There are so many more. We will meet them, one by one. Her name is Magda. She was born to a cobbler's family in a damp little village where the houses leaned into one another like tired drunks. Her mother died when she was 5. Her father remarried a widow who already had 2 sons, both older, both stronger, and both favored. Magda learned quickly how to be quiet, how to make herself useful, how to stay small. By age 10, she was mending boots alongside her father, threading coarse twine through leather soles with fingers rubbed raw. She rose before the sun, swept ashes from the hearth, and boiled what little oats they had into porridge. In the evenings, she watched from behind the door as her stepbrothers were given meat and honey while she scraped bread crusts for her supper. But Magda had eyes like a hawk. She noticed things. She watched how the village healer gathered moss from the north side of trees. She watched the baker's daughter soothe a crying baby by pressing her palm to its chest and humming a low song. She even noticed how, in the coldest days, the oldest widow in the village would never light her fire until midday, and yet she never shivered. These small things stayed with her. She tucked them into her thoughts like feathers into a cloak. At 14, Magda was sent into service at the manor house on the hill. Her father needed coin, and the Baroness needed a scullery maid. So Magda traded her village for stone walls and endless tasks, peeling onions until her fingers stung, scrubbing soot from fireplaces, wringing linens until her arms ached. She slept on a sack in the larder and whispered goodnight to the mice. But she watched, and she learned. She watched the steward keep careful count of grain. She learned how to water down the wine just enough that no one would notice. She learned which kitchen boy stole the honey and which housemaid cried behind the woodshed. She watched the Baroness, who wore fine silk but rarely smiled, and saw in her eyes the same hollow ache Magda had seen in her own mother. One night, when the cook collapsed with a pain in her chest, it was Magda who fetched the root of hawthorn and brewed it into tea. The woman recovered. The Baroness asked no questions, but Magda was moved to the laundry room instead, a step up, though barely. By 17, she could read a little. The house priest left books sometimes in the solar, and she would sneak glances while fetching kindling. She traced the letters with her finger, mouthing the sounds in silence. Knowledge, she realized, was the only coin no one could take from her. She never married. No one asked. And truth be told, she preferred it that way. She grew older, her hair streaked with grey by 25. Her back bent early from lifting pails and scrubbing floors. But she endured. And one day, when the Baroness's daughter fell ill with fever, it was Magda who sat by her bedside, cool cloth in hand, whispering the same hum she'd once heard in the village square. The girl survived. The Baroness, silent as ever, gave her a brooch in thanks. A small thing, silver, shaped like a flower. Magda never wore it. She buried it in the garden beneath the rosemary bush. It was not vanity she sought. It was peace. Let us turn to another life. A woman named Tomasa. Her story begins not in a village, but on the road, born in the back of a wagon, beneath stars that knew no borders. Her family were tinkers, menders, traders of buttons and thread and tails. They moved from town to town, offering their wares in exchange for food, shelter, or coin. Tomasa grew up with stories. Her father told of firebirds and sleeping giants. Her mother sang in a language no one else seemed to know. They were not always welcome. Doors closed when they arrived. Children were called inside. The church bells rang as if in warning. But the road, for all its dangers, was freedom. Tomasa learned how to set traps and catch fish. She learned how to clean wounds and set bones. She carried a satchel full of herbs tied in little cloth bundles, each one marked with a symbol only she could read. When her parents died, fever both of them, one winter, Tomasa was 20 and alone. But she did not stop. She repainted the wagon. She fed the horse when she herself went hungry, and she kept moving. Sometimes she was welcomed. A village in springtime where the baker gave her bread in exchange for a story. A widow who let her sleep in the hayloft. A child who followed her wagon and asked endless questions. Sometimes she was chased off. A stone to the shoulder. A boot in the mud. Names spat like curses, witch, thief, whore. She bore it all, because there was no other way. And in the end, it was Tomasa who brought comfort where none dared go. When plague came to a town and no priest would enter, it was Tomasa who knocked on doors with lavender oil and prayer beads. When a woman bled too much in childbirth and the midwife ran, it was Tomasa who stayed. She was never paid. She asked for nothing. But sometimes in the early dawn, when the sky blushed like a wound, she would hum her mother's song and let the tears fall. They dried before anyone could see. She had a road to follow, and no one else to walk it but her. Then there was Isabeau, a scribe's apprentice, in a city where the stone buildings scraped the sky and the streets sang with the sound of wheels and hooves and bells. She should not have been there. Girls were not taught letters. Girls were not meant for ink-stained fingers and eyes squinted in candlelight. But her uncle, a scribe of some small renown, had no sons. And Isabeau asked too many questions to be silenced, so he let her sit at the corner of his bench, handing him paper, watching how the quill moved. She learned, and then she wrote. Her first letters were clumsy, uneven, but her uncle praised her. She practiced until the curves of her script flowed like a river. She learned Latin before she learned to cook. She memorized psalms and passages from Aristotle. She copied legal documents, wills and sermons. At 15, she forged her uncle's signature perfectly. Not for mischief, but to help a woman. A mother whose husband had died in war. The priest refused to grant her land rights. The nobleman demanded her home in lieu of taxes. Isabeau wrote a letter of claim, sealed it, sent it. The widow kept her home. And Isabeau began to understand what power truly meant. She worked quietly. She hid her texts behind loose stones. She burned her first forged letter, just in case. But she kept writing, for the poor, for the forgotten, for the frightened. She never asked for thanks. She only wanted the ink to matter. Years later, when her uncle passed, no one questioned when she took over the shop. No one dared. Her pen had already rewritten the rules. And still, she signed nothing with her own name. Some truths were better left in shadow. Now, take another breath. Can you feel them? These women long vanished, still here. In every whisper of wind through an open window, in the scent of dried herbs tucked in your kitchen drawer, in the quiet strength you sometimes forget you carry. They were real, and they mattered, even when the world told them otherwise. Let us drift now to a farmstead nestled in the green ridges of the highlands. Here lived a woman named Elswith. She rose each morning with the crows, her breath forming pale clouds in the dawn chill. Her husband, Aldrich, worked the fields with his brothers. Her children, 5, though only 3 still lived, were small, rough-kneed creatures who clung to her apron and wept when she turned her back. Elswith's days were a quiet litany of labor. She churned butter until her arms ached. She baked bread with hands cracked from cold and ash. She sheared sheep in the spring and mended woolen tunics by the firelight in winter. No one recorded her name in the village book. No one thanked her when she knelt to clean the slop from the cottage floor or sat by a sick child's bedside for 3 sleepless nights. But she knew the rhythm of the land. She could feel the coming frost in her knees. She could coax a dying lamb back from the edge with nothing but honey and patience. When Aldrich took ill one year, she managed the fields herself. Broad shoulders bent beneath the plough, skirts tucked at the knees, sun baking her skin into leather. She did not complain. She did not have the time. Once, a traveling friar asked her how she found joy in a life of toil. She looked up from her washing and said simply, "I don't wait for joy, I make it." Then she smiled and returned to scrubbing the blood from a linen sheet. Elswith never sought the world beyond her valley. She didn't need to. The world came to her in small ways. in the flowering of apple trees, in the birth of a calf, in the way the hills turned gold with wheat each autumn. And when she died peacefully in her bed at the age of 62, the village bell rang not once, but 3 times. Not for a noble, not for a priest, but for a woman who never asked for anything and gave everything. We travel now to the coast, where salt hangs in the air and gulls cry like ghosts. There lived a woman named Iseldra, daughter of a fisherman. She was born in a storm. Her mother died before morning. Her father named her after the wind. Iseldra grew wild. She climbed cliffs barefoot and stole eggs from seabird nests. She sang to the waves and swore they answered back. The village called her strange, but left her be, partly out of fear, partly out of superstition. By 16, she knew the tides better than any sailor. She could tell the weather by the taste of the breeze. When boats capsized, she dove into the water without hesitation, dragging men twice her size back to shore. She refused marriage, laughed at the idea, said the sea was her only husband, and he was jealous enough without competition. One winter a sickness came. The fish died, the wells went dry, and Iseldra disappeared. Some said she'd taken to the cliffs and leapt. Others claimed they saw her walking into the sea, arms outstretched as if returning to a lover. But then the storm stopped. The fish returned. The wells filled. And on the shore, each morning, someone found a bundle, roots for healing, dried seaweed for the cattle, firewood soaked in salt to keep away spirits. No one saw her again. But they left offerings on the rocks. Not out of fear, out of gratitude. Let us now move to a darker tale. Her name was Bera. She lived in a stone cell, accused of heresy. Once she'd been a midwife, hands steady, eyes kind. She had delivered over 40 babies in the span of 10 years. She knew which herbs eased labor pains and which chants calmed a frightened mother. She braided protective charms into the hair of newborns and whispered blessings into their tiny ears. But one child was stillborn. The family blamed her. And in the days that followed, when a second baby died of fever, they called her cursed. The village priest, eager to assert his authority, called her a witch. There was no trial, just iron chains and damp walls. They kept her locked beneath the chapel. Rats nibbled at her skirt, rainwater pooled beneath her cot. She heard the bells toll above her every day, each note a reminder that the world went on without her. But she did not cry. She whispered the names of every child she'd ever delivered. She remembered the curve of their cheeks, the way their fists curled, the first cries, the first smiles, the first breath. She whispered these memories like prayers. When they finally opened her cell, 6 months later, after the priest was found guilty of theft and excommunicated, she emerged thin, pale, but unbroken. She never returned to the village. But stories of her healing spread far and wide. Women from distant towns came to find her, bringing bread and dried fruit and coins hidden in their sleeves. They found her in a small cabin near the river, still tending, still listening, still kind. There are so many others. A potter's wife who kept her family fed by selling bowls with secret symbols etched into their glaze. A mute girl who carved stories into driftwood and left them at crossroads for travelers to find. A washerwoman who knew every secret in the village and never spoke a word, but always knew just what to say with a glance. These women lived and died unseen by the chroniclers, the scribes, the lords and kings. But their legacies were passed on, not in books, but in lullabies, in recipes, in the shape of a hand placed on another's back when no words are enough. Now let's rest for a moment. Close your eyes if you wish. Breathe in slowly. And feel the weight of all these lives settle gently around you. You are not alone. You never have been. These women walked paths lined with thorns so others could one day walk with bare feet. Their footsteps echo in yours. And their stories, they live in you now. Let the stillness linger a little longer. We are not yet done. For the world of the medieval woman was not just one of hardship. It was also one of deep, quiet resilience. Each village, each cottage, each corner of the continent held its own story, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, but always lived. Let us now walk through a mountain village, where the peaks pierce the clouds and the wind tastes of pine and snow. Here we find a woman named Mirella. She was not born in this village. She had come from the south, fleeing a war she did not start. Her parents had died in the siege of a stone-walled city. Her younger brother had vanished in the forest. She arrived at the village gates with frost-bitten fingers and nothing but the clothes on her back. The villagers nearly turned her away. They had little food, little warmth, no room for strangers. But an older woman, Tanika, took her in. "Every soul is a burden," she said, "but we carry burdens better together." Mirella learned the dialect. She wove baskets of birch bark and tended goats. She listened more than she spoke. And in time, she became known not as the girl from the south, but simply as Mirella. She had a way with herbs, a way with music. On feast days, she sang songs no one had heard before, soft, winding melodies that made even the strongest men weep. When asked where they came from, she said only, "My mother sang them." It was enough. Years passed. She grew older. Wrinkles lined her eyes. Her hair turned silver like the snow that capped the mountains each spring. And when she died, the villagers planted a single pine tree above her grave. To this day, they say if you sit beneath it during a storm, you can hear her song carried on the wind. Now we return to the flatlands, to the swamps, to the dark places where light filters through moss-covered trees, and every footstep echoes with squelching mud. Here, the world forgot a woman named Lean, but we will not. She lived alone in a hut made of reeds and clay. The children of nearby villages called her a crone. The elders called her wise. Hunters sought her counsel. So did thieves. So did mothers with dying children and fathers who had lost their way. She never turned them away. Lean had one eye that wandered and one leg that dragged slightly. She wore bones in her hair and smelled of rosemary and smoke. Some said she was a witch, but others knew better. She was a memory keeper. She remembered the old ways. The gods before the saints, the songs before the churches, the stories passed from woman to woman in kitchens and fields and dark rooms lit only by fire. When she died, her hut burned, not in violence, but in ritual. Villagers lit it with care. They stood in silence as the flames consumed her home, releasing her spirit to the sky. And in the ashes they found symbols carved into the earth, circles within circles, endless and eternal. To this day, no one builds there. They leave it wild and whisper her name with reverence. The tapestry of history is not just woven by kings and conquerors. It is embroidered by calloused hands in kitchens and on doorsteps and at the edges of battlefields. Women stitched their survival into every hem. They buried their grief in gardens and pulled strength from the soil like beets and onions. Some were nameless, but some still linger in the quiet corners of folk memory. Like Alva, who led a group of widows to rebuild a village after it was razed by invaders. With no tools but kitchen knives and scythes, they drove away scavengers and built walls of mud and timber. When a lord tried to reclaim the land, they stood together, grey-haired and barefoot, and dared him to try. He turned back, or Dagna, who wrote prayers in a language of her own making. Symbols carved on stones and hidden in the roots of trees. Years later, children found them and thought they were magic. And perhaps they were. Perhaps language itself is magic, the power to name, to remember, to endure. In the highlands of the north, a woman named Britha raised 5 children in a crofter's cottage built by her grandfather. Her husband died in a hunting accident. Wolves dragged him away before anyone could bury him. She did not cry. Instead, she taught her sons to trap foxes and mend fences. She taught her daughters to wield knives and thread needles and ride bareback. When a storm washed out the bridge to the village, she carved her own canoe. When a fever swept through, she kept the fire burning for weeks, never sleeping more than an hour at a time, whispering old songs to cool the heads of the burning. Britha aged quickly. Her back curved, her hands trembled. But when she died, her children built a cairn the size of a barn atop the hill. Each stone was a memory. Each stone a thank you. And from the hilltop, you can still see the stars the way she once described them to her youngest, as scattered seeds from the gods waiting to bloom. There were midwives who smuggled books, seamstresses who sewed maps into the lining of cloaks, innkeepers who overheard secrets and passed them to the right people at the right time, daughters who dressed as sons to take their father's place in battle, wives who brewed poisons to free themselves from cruel husbands, nuns who carved pagan symbols into chapel beams, blending old faiths with new. And through it all, through war and plague and famine, women endured. Not always gently, not always quietly, but always. So now if you are still awake, take one more breath. Let your thoughts rest. And let these stories settle in your chest like warm stones. They are not fantasies. They are not fairy tales. They are echoes, real, lived echoes, of lives that shape the world in ways no chronicle ever fully recorded. You carry them with you now. In your blood, in your breath, in your silence, and in your strength. And so we continue gently. Let the wind pass through your mind like it passes through the thatched roofs of forgotten hamlets. There is no rush now. You are here in a quiet corner of time, listening to lives that once glowed like candlelight, dim perhaps to the eyes of those who wrote the grand histories, but never extinguished. Now we walk to the edge of the known world, to the salt-bitten coastlines where gulls circle above and the sea crashes like a wild heartbeat against jagged rocks. Here, a woman named Iseldra lived alone in a tower. She had once been married, though the villagers never learned his name. He was a sailor, they assumed, taken by the sea. Perhaps he had been cruel, or perhaps gentle. But he was gone, and she remained. Iseldra tended bees. She spoke rarely, but she wrote often. Stacks of parchment filled the tower's upper rooms. Her handwriting was small and slanted, and none could read it. She had made her own alphabet, an amalgam of runes, ecclesiastical glyphs, and curling marks like waves. Children said she was mad, but fishermen left her honey at their doorsteps. And when storms came, they lit a single lantern in her tower window and used it to guide their boats to safety. After she died, no one dared enter her tower for a generation. When they finally did, they found not madness, but chronicles, journals, warnings about tides, herbal records, weather patterns spanning 40 years, soft, aching poems about loneliness, about silence, about the beauty of wind in tall grass. They published none of it. But one woman, young, uncertain, full of questions, copied every word by hand, and she still reads them on long, grey nights when the wind howls like sorrow through the stones. In the far east of the kingdom, in forests so thick even sunlight had to negotiate its entry, there lived women who ran. They called them the Green Sisters, not nuns, but rebels, fugitives, and mothers whose children had been taken from them by lords, soldiers, hunger. They made no village. They carried their homes on their backs. They spoke in signs and whistles, not words. And in winter they would disappear into the trees so fully that even wolves could not follow them. It was said they could trap men's souls in jars. That they danced naked with fire and buried copper talismans in the earth to change the weather. None of this was proven, but they were feared. And so they were safe. They raised each other's children, buried each other's dead, and when one was taken or fell ill, the others carved her story into bark and wrapped it in waxed cloth to protect it from the rain. In time, the cloths were found, by monks, by king's men, by travelers, but no one could read the stories. The script was theirs alone, a language birthed from exile, from freedom, from shared pain, and so their truths remain, etched in secrecy, hidden in plain sight. Now let us return to the fields, to the mud and wheat and labor that fed nations while kings spilled wine and blood in their castles. Let us return to the women who bore 10 children and buried 5, to the girls who bled early and married earlier, to the grandmothers who tended fires and spoke stories of the old times, before the church, before the new laws, before the maps drew lines that broke apart their families. Let us remember the herbalists, the weavers, the bread makers, the midwives. They weren't writing sermons or royal decrees. They were pulling water from frozen wells at dawn. They were praying their husbands would not return drunk. They were hiding their bruises or sharpening knives. They were passing secrets in loaves of bread, saving seeds from the best squash, mending their neighbor's only pair of boots, lighting candles for those who never returned from war. These were the acts of survival, and these were acts of rebellion, not loud, not sung, but sacred. A woman in the city once taught street children to read using broken tiles. She carved letters into clay and left them beneath bridges. Another carried messages stitched into quilts to pass between dissidents. Another kept a hidden book of banned stories inside a fake bottom of her bread box, passed to her by a friend who died in childbirth. One nursed her husband through the plague even as her own lungs filled with fluid. Another dug a grave with her bare hands for a child no priest would bury because he had not lived long enough to be christened. Their names have not survived, but their strength has, because strength is not always made of muscle or roar. Sometimes it is made of silence, of staying, of simply not giving up when everything says you should. So now, dear listener, lay your burdens beside theirs. Let your breath deepen. Feel the weight of their lives resting in your chest, not heavy like sorrow, but warm like remembrance. History did not remember them, but you do now. And that matters. That changes things. You are the thread that continues their story. You are the fire still burning. You are the echo of every song sung beneath a patchwork ceiling, every whispered lullaby in a cold stone room. So sleep now if you wish, or watch the stars if you can see them. But let your heart stay soft. Let it honor the forgotten. Let it beat quietly for the women who endured, and for those still enduring, still here, still unseen, but never unloved. In the northern hills, where winters arrived early and the fog clung to the ground like a second skin, a village once stood that no longer appears on any map. It was small, built mostly of wattle and daub, and every roof wore a cap of moss by late autumn. In this village lived a girl named Maris. She was born just as the first snow of the year began to fall, and so her mother called her Snow's daughter. Her father died before she could speak, taken not by war or pestilence, but by a splintered cart wheel that crushed him against a frozen oak. It was a common sort of death, sharp, quiet, and forgotten. Maris grew in silence. She did not babble like the other children. She did not cry when she was hungry. Her eyes were dark and still, like the river in winter. They said she was odd. Her mother, who worked the fields and buried 3 of her other children before Maris turned 10, said she was blessed, or cursed, but loved all the same. Maris began to speak not with words, but with herbs. At 12, she could name every plant that grew within a mile of their village, could bind up wounds better than the midwife, and knew how to place rowan twigs above a crib to keep spirits at bay. At 15, she brought back a boy from the brink of fever when the rest had given up. At 16, she whispered a prayer into the hollow of a dead tree and found a lost cow 2 days later, standing unharmed in the glen. She never explained herself, but when women gave birth, they wanted Maris beside them. When bones broke, they came to her door. When things went missing, goats, rings, sons, they asked her to find them. She didn't always succeed, but she always tried. Then the bishop came. With red robes, a jeweled cross, and eyes that did not blink often, he declared her unnatural, called her a witch. She was taken to the village square, made to kneel, made to confess what she did not understand. She did not scream, she did not plead. She looked up at the snow, falling softly on her lashes, and whispered something no one could hear. But the bishop turned pale and left the village before dawn. No one ever came for her again. And she lived a long life, quiet, herb-stained and holy in a way no church ever named. When she died, her grave was marked not with a cross, but a garland of thyme and hawthorn. And even now, the children of that valley say, if you get lost in the woods and listen carefully, you'll hear her hum, a lullaby of moss and frost, guiding you home. There was another kind of woman, too, the scribe's daughter. In a bustling town that clung to the edge of a river, where trade boats crowded like pigeons in a square, she lived above a shop that smelled of ink and burnt parchment. Her name was Lien. Her father had gone blind before she was born, and so she read to him, every day. Religious texts, shipping ledgers, letters from merchants, plays from traveling troops, anything with words. By the time she was 10, she could write faster than any apprentice. By 14, she was binding books by hand, mixing her own dyes, even illuminating letters with tiny dragons and saints' faces. But she could not sign her name on a guild roster, could not own a stall, could not read aloud in public, not because she wasn't good enough, but because she was a girl. Still, she wrote. She copied texts by candlelight until her fingers bled. She rewrote old stories, changing endings where women lived instead of died. She added commentary in the margins, notes no one noticed until decades later when scholars puzzled over the rose-handed ink maiden, whose words were sharp as nettles and beautiful as frost. They say she smuggled entire books to nuns in the countryside, that she taught orphan girls to read by carving letters into bread crusts. When the plague came, she sealed up her shop and stayed inside, wrote until her ink ran dry. And when she died, alone, as many did, her manuscripts outlived her. They were unsigned, but full of her. Because sometimes legacy is not a name etched in stone. Sometimes it's words folded into vellum, waiting patiently for someone to understand. Now breathe, deeply, and return again to the quiet places, to the thatched roofs and chicken-feathered courtyards, to the hill shrines, to the roadside graves marked with stones and cloth, to the women who sang while they worked. Not because they were happy, but because it kept them human, because it kept their pain in rhythm, because it was a way to say, I'm still here. These women didn't ride into battle. They didn't write treaties or command armies, but they shaped everything, with hands chapped by lye soap, with backs bent from harvests, with lullabies and warnings and secrets passed from one to another like river stones, smooth from time but unbroken, and you remember them now. So their stories grow again, like wildflowers in abandoned fields. In a valley where the fog never quite lifted, even by midsummer, there lived a woman named Isabet, known only by her spindle. She was not born into wealth, nor even into comfort. Her family tilled the land for others and paid their dues in bushels and backs bent from sunup to twilight. But her hands, they were different. They spun wool so fine it slipped through fingers like water. Even the abbess in the next town sent riders to collect her work. She did not speak much. Her eyes were light grey, like frost that never melts, and her voice was soft as a reed whistle. The villagers said she'd been touched by the old gods, those that lived in the trees and whispered in winter winds, not because she performed miracles, but because she moved as though time listened to her. She never married. Some said it was because she had a lover who drowned when she was a girl, and she still walked the banks waiting for him to rise. Others claimed no man dared ask her, fearing she might turn to mist and vanish. But the truth was simpler. Isabet had made a life with her loom, her sheep, and her solitude. She wove tapestries of incredible detail, stories threaded in wool, women planting seeds beneath moons, children laughing near rivers, old women dancing around fire circles under stars. She said little, but her art said everything. When a famine struck and crops withered to dust, it was Isabet who spun coarse cloth for every family, even those who had mocked her silence. When the winter was longest and the graveyard grew crowded, she left warm scarves and socks on the doorsteps of widows and orphans. She was not a saint. She did not preach. She did not lead. But she endured. And when she passed in the late spring, alone, quietly as she had lived, the women of the valley gathered. They did not mourn in the usual way. They sat in her house for days, spinning side by side, retelling her stories through yarn and fabric and silence. And in every home, for generations after, a small corner of wool tapestry hung, stitched with a tree or a moon or a spindle in her memory. Because even in a world that did not write their names in books, some women became legends in thread. Southward, near the coast where gulls cried and the air always smelled faintly of salt and smoke, there lived a woman named Dagna. Her skin was toughened by sea wind, and her fingers were always red from brine and nets. She was a fisherwoman's daughter, born in a storm and raised in the lull between tides. She married young, a boy with golden hair and a laugh too big for the small village. He was taken by the sea before their second spring together. But she did not weep. Instead, she rose the next morning before the light, picked up his nets, and took his boat out alone. The men in the village scoffed. The priest warned her against prideful ambition. But she kept rowing. Through fog and wind, through waves that slapped the bow like a punishment. She fished as well as any man. Better, some whispered. When storms came, it was her sails that returned, battered but not broken. When others drowned, she mourned them, then sailed again. She became the rhythm of the village. She took no second husband. She spoke little, but her presence on the dock meant things would be okay. In time, she taught other women to fish. Widows' daughters, even the baker's wife. And when she died, they placed her oars on her grave. Weathered, smooth, worn to her shape. No statue marked her place. No hymn was sung, but the sea remembers. And when the tide pulls just right, old sailors say you can hear her voice, low, steady, humming through the mist. Now pause. Let the hush of these stories settle around you like linen sheets warmed by fire, because there are more, so many more. There was the girl who walked 20 miles to seek an herbal cure for her mother. The mother who gave up her bread so her child could live. The healer who buried her knowledge in coded drawings when the church outlawed her craft. The shepherdess who knew the stars better than the monks did. The nun who etched poetry into the margins of psalters and never signed her name. And for every name lost to time, there are echoes. In recipes, in lullabies, in the curve of a letter, in the hem of a gown passed from mother to daughter, stitched not with gold but with care. You are not meant to remember them all. Only to know they were there. They lived. They tried. They suffered. They survived. Not always gracefully, not always without bitterness or grief, but they endured in a world built to forget them. And tonight as you listen, perhaps they breathe a little easier because someone remembers, even now, even softly, even in the hush between one breath and the next. Further inland, beyond the wheat fields and winding trade routes, stood a forest so old that even the trees had forgotten their first spring. And in the shadows of its edge nestled a small croft, barely more than timber and thatch. There lived an old woman named Marda. She was what the villagers called a root wife. Not a witch, though some whispered the word when they thought she couldn't hear. Not a nun, though she knew every herb that ever touched a psalter's page. She lived alone, except for the goats and the hounds and the vines that curled around her windows like protective fingers. Children feared her until they were sick. Then their mothers came knocking, for teas, for poultices, for prayers not spoken in churches. Marda never refused, but she did not give easily. You had to listen, you had to learn. She would press dried chamomile into your palm and say, "This is for peace, but peace must be earned." She would make you crush the leaves yourself, smell them, name them, say thank you aloud to the plant. She told stories of green spirits and bone-buried gods, not to frighten, but to remind. The earth remembers what men forget. She had once been a midwife, they said. Delivered 100 babies with those thick-knuckled hands. Some made it, some didn't. Each time she lit a candle. She never said why. When the village priest tried to ban her work, saying only the church could heal now, a fever swept through the hamlet. It was Marda's door they came to, and she opened it. She did not keep ledgers. She did not name prices. But when she passed, on a winter's night with no moon, the forest stood still. And in the weeks after, children said the goats still listened at her door, waiting. In the north, where the wind cuts sharper and the sky burns orange at dusk, lived a girl who never learned to read, but knew how to survive. Her name was Sanna. She was not beautiful in the way minstrels sang of, no golden curls, no ruby lips. Her hair was like straw and her hands were always dirty. But she had the kind of gaze that made you lower yours. A defiant fire flickered there, barely concealed. She was sold, like many girls were, to a distant cousin's household. A serving girl, they called her, though she was more often a scapegoat than a servant. Beaten for spills, starved for imagined slights. But she was clever, she watched, she remembered. She counted the eggs in the basket each morning before her mistress did. She saw which key unlocked the pantry. She learned how to boil cabbage just long enough to seem cooked, but not so long it turned sour. She knew when to speak, and more importantly, when to vanish. In time, she began slipping scraps to the stable boy. He brought her news in return. Whispers of a merchant's caravan leaving at dawn, a peddler who didn't ask questions, a convent looking for novices. One morning, before the rooster cried, she was gone. Her mistress cursed her name, but no one ever found her. Years later, in another town, there lived a woman who ran a hostel for travelers. She could fix a wheel, bind a wound, and brew beer better than the monks did. They called her Mistress Sanna, and though she never spoke of where she came from, she always hired the orphan girls first. In the markets of a bustling port city, where ships from 10 kingdoms docked daily and the air smelled of spice and sweat, walked a woman in worn leather boots and a tattered scarf. Her name was Mirin. She had no trade license, no husband, no father to vouch for her. But she had a ledger, and she had secrets. Mirin was a broker, not of money, though coins clinked in her pocket, not of bodies, though the docks were full of men who tried. She dealt in knowledge. She knew which merchant was laundering coin through linen exports, which steward's wife bought moonflowers on full moons, which bishop visited the apothecary too often for someone in good health. She sold nothing illegal, but everything dangerous. And she kept every letter she ever received, folded perfectly, stacked beneath the floorboards. She was arrested once, briefly, but the magistrate's brother owed her too much. She was released by sundown, and after that, People called her Mother Mirin, half mocking, half reverent. She had no children, but every girl who came to her, frightened, penniless, shamed, left with a bag of silver and a new name. Her ledger was burned when she died, but her letters, they survived. And some say they're still passed in quiet circles, teaching young women how to write their own stories, line by line. Further east, among the foothills where lavender grew wild, lived twin sisters born into silence. One was blind, the other mute. They were considered cursed, left in the care of a reclusive aunt who lived off wild honey and goat cheese. But they did not wither. They learned to speak in gestures. They mapped their world through touch and breath and the rhythm of each other's footsteps. Together they learned to stitch, to dye, to bind books, not with words, but with patterns. Each fabric told a story. Each knot meant something. When pilgrims passed through, they wept at the sisters' embroidery. They said they could feel something in it. Memory, sorrow, hope. The sisters never charged coin, but they asked for stories. Each traveler gave one, and the sisters wove them in. Their tapestries became maps of love, of grief, of endurance. No one remembered their names, but their work was preserved in convents, mislabeled as holy relics. And if you run your fingers along the edge, some say you can feel a heartbeat. Rest now. Let your mind drift as these quiet lives unfold around you. Not grand, not gilded, not sung by choirs or crowned by kings, but real. More real than parchment or portraits. Women who loved and lost and worked and waited and broke bread with trembling hands. Their stories are still here, in the lull of a spinning wheel, in the scent of crushed lavender, in the silence after a long day when no one is watching, and you are simply breathing. You are part of this lineage too. By listening, by remembering, by letting their names, unspoken though they were, echo just a little longer. On the cold edges of a mountain pass, where even sunlight felt like a rumor, lived a woman known only as the Widow. Her name had long been buried beneath layers of grief and frost. She'd once had a husband, tall, strong, beloved, and a daughter with raven hair who sang to the sheep. But they were taken, one by illness, the other by war. She did not remarry. She did not speak of them. She built her own home, stone by stone. In spring, she gathered mountain herbs. In winter, she fed the wolves. The villagers whispered about her. Some said she was mad, others said she could turn snow into fire. Children dared each other to run past her gate. But if a mother needed help during childbirth, it was the widow they sent for. And she came, always. She wore no crucifix. She carved prayers into wood. She buried her dead with her own hands. And every year on the first snowfall, she left 2 bowls of broth outside her door. One for the man she loved, one for the child who never grew old. No one knew what she believed, but her silence held more sacredness than any sermon. Far to the south, where olives grew thick and the air carried the scent of warm earth, lived a girl with a back curved from labor and a heart unbent by it. Her name was Elira. She was born into a tenant household. Her father paid in sweat. Her mother paid in blood. The Lord's men came each spring to measure the fields and tally the lives. Elira learned to keep her eyes low, but her mind wandered. She watched the birds, how they returned, always, even when chased. She mimicked their calls. She learned how to climb the olive trees faster than any boy, barefoot and laughing, and she began carving little birds from fallen twigs. Her first gift was to her mother, who smiled with cracked lips and tucked it into her apron. One day, a passing nobleman's carriage broke an axle on the road outside her village. While the men quarreled, Elira handed his daughter a carved sparrow. The girl squealed with delight. The nobleman asked who had made it. The steward scowled. Just a peasant girl. But the nobleman saw. He paid a silver coin, more than Elira's family had seen in months, and so she carved more. Birds, horses, trees, lovers kissing beneath stars. Soon merchants were asking for Elira's charms. She never left the village, but her carvings traveled far, and when she died they found hundreds more hidden in her roof beams, her story told in feathers and wings. In a windswept coastal town, a monastery perched high on the cliffs overlooked a restless sea. Inside its stone walls, amidst ink and silence, lived Sister Halwyn. She was no novice, no meek, cloistered girl. She had once been a warrior's wife, but after the war took him and the plague took their son, she shaved her head and took vows, not to forget, but to remember on her terms. She became the abbey's scribe. The men scoffed. but her pen was precise, and her memory even more so. She wrote not only psalms and sermons, but histories, unofficial ones, stories of the washerwomen who hid plague victims, of girls who disguised themselves as boys to learn letters, of lovers who fled into the forest and built their own gods from moss and ash. She tucked them between the pages of illuminated manuscripts, carefully, reverently. In gold ink, she wrote one word in the margins over and over again: listen. When she grew old, and her hands shook too much to hold a quill, the younger scribes found her pages. They were not burned, they were preserved, taught, read in secret, copied by candlelight. And when Sister Holwyn passed, the waves crashed louder than ever, as if the sea itself mourned her memory. And so across the many folds of medieval time, across forests, cities, coastlines, and cliffs, there existed women who were never in the paintings, who never wore crowns, whose names never made it to records. But they lived, and their living mattered. Their fingerprints remain, on bread kneaded before sunrise, on fabric dyed in forgotten colors, on the pages that still smell faintly of lavender and wax. They were not saints, they were not villains, they were human. And perhaps that is the most sacred thing of all. As we reach the end of this quiet journey, let the world fall silent around you. Feel the warmth of their kitchens. Hear the hush of their footsteps on dirt floors. Picture them lighting candles against the dark, not to be seen, but to see. You've walked beside them now, not as a student, not as a scholar, but as a guest. And in doing so, you've honored them. Thank you for listening, for remembering, for letting their gentle history become part of your own. Now rest. Let the night cradle you. Let their stories echo like lullabies, soft, enduring, and never truly lost. The fields beyond the village, once mere stretches of labor and repetition, changed their hue with the seasons, and to the watchful eye, they told quiet stories of their own. In spring, when the rains loosened the frost-hardened soil, the earth was black and damp and smelled of promise. The women who bent over it, planting barley or beans, may not have named hope out loud, but it lived in their every movement. A sprouting green shoot was more than a sign of crop. It was an unspoken prayer being answered. Older women, those who had survived many planting seasons and watched their children grow into laborers, held knowledge in their joints and calloused hands. They could read the skies without raising their eyes. They felt the weather in their knees, predicted hunger in the flicker of migrating birds, and understood that nature was not a separate entity. They lived as part of it, inseparably, reverently. In the hush of the evening, as the last embers of sun streaked gold across the thatch rooftops, the village transformed into a place of story. The spinning wheel hummed in the corner of many homes, turning wool into thread beneath the steady foot of a woman who had known childbirth, hunger, and celebration all in the same span of months. Her children lay bundled by the fire, listening as she spoke softly, not in lessons but in tales passed down like heirlooms. Of saints who wept miracles, of forests that could hear footsteps, of women who became birds or rivers or starlight if wronged too deeply. These weren't distractions from life, they were interpretations of it. Sometimes there were pauses in the work. Feast days, market days, holy days. Though life was stitched with hardship, it was also hemmed with ritual. The Feast of St. Agnes or the day honouring St. Bridget brought moments of joy, processions of flowers, music from flutes carved by hand. Women gathered with ribbons braided into their hair, their feet blistered, but their laughter real. For a breath, life lightened. But feast days didn't pause the wait forever. Grief was a constant companion. Child mortality was not a phrase. They simply said the baby didn't survive. Sometimes they said it didn't take. And each time the village moved slightly slower, the bell tolled gently, and someone walked to the edge of the woods to dig a small resting place. The burial ground was marked by wooden crosses and stones with no names. But the names lived on in lullabies sung to the next child, in whispered prayers during storm season, in the way someone stirred stew and left room for one more bowl. Marriage for women often came early, and rarely from romance. It was alliance, economy, survival. Girls knew this by 12. They watched their mothers negotiate with fathers and landholders, and they noticed the way their future husbands paid. Eyes studied their hips before their faces. They weren't ignorant of desire. They simply learned early that it came second to duty. Love, if it grew, came later. Sometimes not at all. Still, there was sisterhood. Among women, especially those who had seen too much, there was a knowing. A midwife might not smile as she arrived at a birthing, but she would grip your hand tight and say your name like a promise. A neighbor might leave herbs at your door without explanation. A grandmother might press a charm into your palm before your wedding night, muttering words from a dialect older than the church bells. Even the church, so grand in its Latin and incense, was softened by the way women navigated its demands. They sang the hymns, yes, but they also carved little crosses into tree bark in secret. They lit candles for saints and buried moon-blessed stones for fertility beneath their thresholds. They obeyed, and they resisted. In silence, in song. In the bending of rules, only they saw bend. And when the years passed, as they always did, the women aged into roles that made them almost sacred. A grandmother was no longer a worker of fields, but of memory. Children asked her to repeat the story of the fire, the flood, the day the cow gave birth, and everyone sang. She would tell it again, slowly, with pauses for breath and reverence. Her wrinkles weren't shame, they were scripture, written proof of all she had endured. Her death, when it came, was not a tragedy. It was a returning. Women washed her body with lavender and lye. They wrapped her in cloth she may have spun herself. They cried, but not as those who had no hope. They knew where she had gone. And in the coming days, when they boiled broth or sang over a cradle, her voice would still echo softly behind theirs. And so the seasons rolled forward like the turning of a worn wheel, creaking softly across the stones of history. As we reach the final pages of this long night's telling, let us linger once more in the flicker of firelight and the hush of the medieval world. That world where hardship shaped lives not with cruelty alone, but with a strange and stubborn grace. In those quiet fields where women bent to pull weeds with blistered hands, there was strength. It lived in calloused palms and in the lullabies sung despite hollow stomachs. In dim kitchens where mothers stirred pots of meager broth while snow pushed against thin wooden walls, there was resilience that defied the cold. And in the secret corners of convents, where ink met parchment under the soft breath of candlelight, there was wisdom preserved by steady hands, not for praise, but for preservation, for future daughters who might read it when the world was kinder. For every story of suffering, there was another quietly defiant. The girl who learned to read by eavesdropping on the priest. The midwife who delivered life in the same room where death once sat. The widow who mended nets by the shore and fed 3 children on fish guts and hope. These weren't heroines in books. They didn't wear crowns or led armies, but they were architects of their households, defenders of the hearth, holders of memory. The songs they sang were lullabies and laments, and they lasted longer than many battles. Let us not imagine that suffering made them saints, nor that struggle is holy. It was simply reality, endured without applause. Yet through it all, they carved out love and laughter where they could. They laughed at geese who stole bread, gossiped in church pews when they ought not to, danced barefoot in the mud during harvest festivals, and whispered stories of ghosts and saints to frighten the children just before bed. Even the sick room had its moments of humanity. A hand brushed a damp brow, a prayer murmured in rhythm with the slowing breath of the dying. A child tucked beneath layers of worn wool, soothed to sleep by the rasp of their grandmother's voice. Life was always a thread pulled between dark and light, between hunger and celebration, between burial and birth. And what of the dreams they carried, stitched deep into their hearts like secret embroidery? Perhaps a better year ahead. A winter not so long, a son who might survive past infancy, a daughter who might learn to write her name. Dreams as small and precious as seeds, fragile, yes, but also fiercely held. We, looking back, owe them more than pity. We owe them presence. For they were not faceless shadows in old scrolls. They were real, warm, aching people, like you, like me. They deserve to be remembered, not just in the dust of records or the footnotes of kings, but in full color, with the sound of their laughter echoing across the centuries. So now, let the candles dim, let the quiet return. The story has been long, and your mind perhaps soft with sleep. That's all right. It was meant to be so. As your thoughts drift, you may carry with you not just the facts of history, but the feeling of it. The warmth of a hearth fire, the scent of wet wool, the murmur of voices in a thatched home. You've walked with the women who endured, who loved, who lost, and who lived anyway. Tomorrow will come with its lights and demands and lists and clocks, but for now you've been somewhere else. Somewhere slower, quieter, rougher, and yet somehow still tender. This is not the end of the story, but it is a good place to rest. Sleep well, traveller of time. We'll meet again in the folds of history.